Welcome to the Digital Authoritarianism podcast series. Each episode uncovers how digital technologies are reshaping authoritarian politics, revealing global and regional patterns of digital repression and the creative ways civil societies fight back, speaking to researchers, journalists, and activists. The hosts of this podcast are Janjira, Sangeeta, and Andreas, research fellows at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, Hamburg. We are glad to share this important conversation with you. Let's dive in.
Welcome, everyone, to the fourth episode of our podcast series on digital authoritarianism, brought to you by the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, or the GIGA for short. My name is Janjira Sombai-Punseri. I'm a research fellow at the GIGA and a co-lead of our project with the same name, Digital Authoritarianism Through Lawfare in Asia. In this project, we explore how legal practices and policies across South and Southeast Asia are being used to advance authoritarian control and restrict civil society rights. This initiative builds on our earlier research examining how governments in the region use information laws to criminalize dissent. And so as part of that work, we developed an online tracker, fakenewslawfare.com, as you can see in my background here. If you haven't checked that out yet, I really encourage you to have a quick look and perhaps use the database that is out there. So today, I am extremely excited to welcome Dr. Yatun Sastramidjaja. Beyond being my dear friend, Yatun is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Amsterdam, whose research and advocacy focuses on resistance and resilience in a world where power, politics, and struggle move into cyberspace with real-world effects. And I think we're in the right context for this. So a little bit about our first encounter and relationship, maybe. I first met Yatun back in 21, I believe, when we were visiting fellows at the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. And since then, I've had the privilege of being involved in her research project on computational propaganda and cyber troops in Southeast Asia, led by Yatun and her colleagues at the University of Amsterdam. Most excitingly, Yatun has just received a European Research Council Consolidator grant. Yay, congratulations again. To explore how protest movements navigate digital repression and even disrupt the infrastructures enabling it in Asia. This work is closely allied with our project, Digital Repression in Asia, especially the component on civil societies' counteractions to digital authoritarianism, an area which I'm responsible for. And so the podcast today is really, really exciting, and I'm super thrilled to have Yatun, and I look forward to delving into our conversation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yatun. So Yatun, hello.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Janjira, for having me. I think this podcast is an excellent, relevant, timely initiative, and I'm so honored to be part of it. So that's great. Shall I just, tell you a little bit about how I got to this project? Because like you just mentioned, it's on my profile, on my website, institution website, that I am indeed looking at resistance and resilience and repression as it moves into cyberspace. And that happened actually since about 2020 or so. But it started with youth activism. And that's something I've been researching for a very long time now, since the student movement in Indonesia actually that toppled or helped to topple Suharto's New Order regime in 1998. And more recently, this wave after wave of youth movements across Asia that we've seen that are driven or led by youth and that are very clearly also driven by social media mobilization. So this is why I got into digital activism, because activism moved into the digital sphere, and I thought, well, let's follow it there. Now, on the other component of my research, because there's two components. So the first is digital activism, and the second is the flip side, you could say, of this digital politics, and that's digital repression. And the project that you mentioned, of which you were a brilliant part with others on cyber troops in Southeast Asia, was one part of that. And well, for the youth activism and digital activism part, I was looking at, okay, how do these digital media then contribute to the introduction of new repertoires? How are existing repertoires of contention also influenced? And how are new then repertoires invented, right, with the use of digital media? But then on the flip side, for digital repression, you could also see the same kind of questions. So, okay, how do digital tools and technologies then enable, authoritarian and autocratic regimes to also reinvent their repertoires of repression, which were already in place, of course, how they found new uses for these repertoires, and how new repertoires of repression, control, surveillance, and intimidation were also introduced into this struggle. So, but these are two sides, two components of a research agenda. And I know, Janjira, that you also started your research career researching protest, right? And activism and movements. And then you moved more to the authoritarianism aspect of the story. And the dark side. And somehow these two sides, the light and the dark, they shall never meet, right? They often remain very separate research agendas, lines of inquiry. And I think that's a mischance, because what we see is that both digital activism, so that side, and digital repression actually evolve in tandem, right? So activism, digital activism, and other forms of activism that are part of that, they respond to evolving repertoires of digital repression. And at the same time, the repertoires of digital repression, the way laws are formulated, the way laws are implemented, the way cyber troops are mobilized, to kind of create certain narratives on social media, it really evolves also in response to swelling protest movements, for instance. So when there's a rise in protest movements, you see also a rise in repression, and that's the cycle. So how do they evolve together? And this is where my new ERC project then comes in, because I want to see from the activism perspective, okay, how do they, different groups of activism in different countries, different settings, but also different levels of, from the local to the transnational, how do they adapt themselves, their repertoires, to digital repression, which is becoming more and more insidious throughout Asia? And in doing so, how do they also themselves as movements change, right? How are their movement infrastructures? So all the media, but also tools and the infrastructures through which their resources flow, the resources on which movements depend, including ideas. So not just information, money, but also ideas. How are these infrastructures also reconfigured as activists forcibly need to adapt to this increasingly repressive conditions that we see?
This is super interesting, and I think it's a real gap, right? In our emerging field, because as you said, scholars and practitioners either focus on repression or on digital mobilization, and I think this kind of like parallel developments of both sides are super crucial in understand the dynamics of both phenomena, right? Now, this question is not a part of the list of questions I sent you, but I'm super curious, like when you study digital repression, especially carried out by state actors, it seems that state actors have actually more resources. They have institutional memory. and they pass down repertoires. Actually, the budgets get bigger and bigger each year for surveillance, for smear campaigns, for cyber troops that we study, right?
Yeah.
So movements, as the name has it, are very fluctuating. Movements emerge and fade away and then re-emerge, right? So how could a movement match the capacity of states when it comes to countering repression?
Well, the very short answer is they can't. Not
Mm,
in the same battlefield, in the same arena as where all these different forms of digital repression are rolled out. And because they don't have the resources, they don't have, millions and millions of rupiah or baht or whatever to
mm,
spend on that. And neither should they also. So what we see is that more and more activists are starting to realize that, like, hey, we can't win this battle on their terms,
mm,
right?
mm,
With their tools because we lack the same tools. So why not shift the battleground then? So, and this is what my project is also looking into. So, what happens if you decenter the digital in mobilization? Because now, because movements and mobilizations have become so dependent on digital media,
mm,
it seems like they almost cannot do without. This is the only way to get people out on the streets and to create even a revolution, or the semblance of a revolution, as we've seen in Nepal recently, right? Which was fully organized on social media and through Discord. The new
mm,
interim leader was also elected, and so on. But of course, the digital arena is the one that is very easily controlled by authoritarian state forces, and especially in a time where where the interests of authoritarian states and big tech also come to intersect because they
mm.
get access.
Yeah.
Of course, they buy the access, but at least they have access to the most sophisticated kind of surveillance tools, especially now with AI. You don't want to know. I mean, it's a horrible, probably, I don't know
Mm,
the details, what
mm,
they're now trying to experiment with in the Iran war, for instance, with artificial intelligence and so on. So those are the next steps. And how can you, as an activist group, ever win that battle, right?
mm, mm,
So, but once you decenter the digital as being the main, as that's not where the main battleground is, this is where you can see activists starting to mobilize in places, in settings,
mm,
in with causes that are much less easily colonized by
mm,
the tools of the regime. So yeah, this is what we're trying to investigate. I don't know how, what that will look like because we're just starting.
mm,
But I think this is one of the dimensions that we can look at as scholars also. Like
mm,
not just to be too focused on, what happens in the digital arena, both from the repression side and from the
mm,
activism side.
mm,
But yeah, in terms of
mm,
anything that's invisible in that arena, what kind of
mm.
interesting things do we see evolving there?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, When you mention decentering the digital, can you provide a concrete example of how that looks like? Because, from what I heard, it could be a hybrid mode of mobilization, online, offline, which is difficult to differentiate anyway these days,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, maybe some concrete example for our listeners.
Well, the most one of the coolest venues that I visit every year is the Digital Rights Asia Pacific Assembly,
Mm.
DRAPAC.
Drapak, yeah, yeah, yeah.
DRAPAC, yes, and it was in Taiwan. No, it was in Kuala Lumpur last time, and
That's
there
yeah,
before that in Taiwan, and then in Manila
yeah. This
this
year,
June.
Manila, yeah.
Yeah, and
Mm.
they have really interesting workshops, which actually, works with paper, for instance. So what I found super
Mm.
cool is when these very high-tech, savvy activists, who are really super aware of all the digital affordances of repressions and so on, who really understand what a internet shutdown, for instance, looks like, how it works, and what the latest developments in those kind of technologies of repression are, how they then disseminate know-how, not just understanding and awareness, but also know-how of how to evade that kind of repression by, for instance, a card game, so that communities on the ground learn how to respond in case of different forms of repression. So in case of an internet shutdown, in case of digital intimidation and digital violence, online violence and attacks, in a very playful manner and in a very material manner. So I find that very telling. It's not the first thing you think about when you think about kind of revolutionary struggle and so on,
Yeah.
and how to dismantle digital repression. But it certainly does help us rethink, like, hey, what other tools can we use to kind of, evade the system and maybe even sabotage it in James Scott's way, right? Through the infrapolitics of resistance in everyday manners.
This is so interesting because, I've been hearing stories from activists how the sabotage part, so how they tricked sort of the pro-government trolls in
Yeah.
Thailand to kind of say something seriously idiotic online, collectively, without knowing, because basically they would trick these people to say an acronym collectively, and they would trick them in a way that they would deceive them that this acronym stands for we love the monarchy. But in fact, it's an underground acronym for something else completely terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
trick them to say that online collectively, and they become a joke. So I think that rings a bell of this kind of like evasion, deception,
Yeah.
tricksters kind of behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Super interesting. Now, you've done research on youth activism. Has it been a decade now or longer? As around
On digital youth activism around,
10 years.
something like that.
Yeah.
A long time. For the
So,
student activism, actually, since 2000. So
oh
that's
wow.
how old I am. Yeah.
Okay, let's not review that.
No.
Well, we're young at heart.
Yeah.
Um, Now, I mean, more often than not, and this also has to do with the practitioners in my field, which is like civil resistance, right?
Yeah.
So people always want to assess, evaluate success of movements, right? But I think, with the advent of digital technologies and the widespread of youth activism this day, I mean, the old assessment no longer works or applies in this new context, right? So, in your
Yeah.
research, how do young activists define success actually when they carry out protests?
Well, the problem is that a lot of these measures of success are still really, they still follow the old paradigm of have we brought down a regime yet, in a sense, which doesn't happen that often in history. I mean, the revolution, in Nepal in September 2025, that is often showcased as the most successful Gen Z revolution that we've seen in our age because it brought down a regime. Similarly, in 1998, the student movement in Indonesia was said to be a successful movement because it helped to topple a regime. But I remember when that also happened in Bangladesh in 2024. I spoke with activists who were they didn't want to call themselves leaders; they wanted to call themselves who coordinated that co-coordinated that protest. And they were not naive. I mean, they said this is not even the beginning of what needs to happen to see real change happen in our country, which is much, the problems are much more structural and in depth than just who is on top in the leadership. In terms of even patriarchal structures, class structure, social, economic inequalities, access to political resources, and so on, political capital. So all that, they were not naive. So they would not say this was our biggest success moment of glory. I mean, maybe that's how the media would frame it, or some leaders, movement leaders would like to frame it. But so no, the real measure for success for a lot of these new generation activists is, okay, do we see some form of justice, accountability, greater equality, and many of those really difficult to attain structural issues, but they know that those are necessary in order to achieve change. So they're not naive and not very celebratory, but of course, small successes, government concessions are always celebrated. You need that to keep the spirit. Like when in August, in Indonesia after the protest, the perks, these outrageous perks and privileges of parliamentarians were revoked, like their crazy housing allowances and so. Then, of course, that needs to be. But they know that this is not the success of. That doesn't count as success. It's a small concession that they won. So this is very difficult. And this is, of course, a reason where you would say, okay, this is not something that they might see happen, what they define as real success in their own lifetime, even though they're really young. It's very easy to then fall into a sense of dishope, like it's not gonna happen anyway. But and this is why I see that more and more there's a lot of attention to caring about micro changes. What they can actually achieve on a micro level in terms of even in terms of making taboo issues discussable. Having a screening on taboo issues in a nice, documentary setting and so on. But to have the discussion opened, that already counts as a measure of success. To have a discussion among people who were not discussing certain issues before would be considered a successful step in the right direction.
I mean, I think this is absolutely important to remind ourselves, like what meanings change can have, right? And I think it's crucial. Like, I mean, you are by training an anthropologist. I am like half-bred between political scientist, sociologist, and in my discipline, people always want to assess, for example, in the case of Thailand, whether or not the government has become more democratic, and then you scramble, looking for index, right? That, protests happened this year, next year, whether or not Thailand has become more democratic. So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit like how anthropology helps you to understand and make sense of young people's perception of change, as you just mentioned, micro changes?
Yeah. Yeah, really by looking at the everyday. So, what kind of mood do you see evolving? What kind of practices do you see happening, in everyday life, in everyday expressions online, especially also, because for me, a lot of, mood can be gogged there. Before and after big protest events, and this is why I keep looking at these protest pages on Instagram now, for instance, where a lot of discussion and a lot of discursive developments are happening actually outside of anything that makes the news right now, and sometimes things. So if you look at change, right, and of course activists they strive for change, and they strive also for measurable change in a sense. So there are two kinds of change in that sense. There's the deliberate change process. This is why a lot of activists are also called change makers. They have a plan and they have steps to achieve that plan, and goals and targets and so on. So that's whether they receive, especially, more small scale targets, that can be then called a success. And some form of change in the sense that another change, for instance, that a village has been evicted for another mine, for instance, is not happening. So preventing some change can also be a form of success in that sense. So
Mm,
those are the deliberate kind of change processes and targets that they have. But
mm,
sometimes change can also be accidental almost, nobody planned for it and it happens. And one example that I find very interesting is that during the August 2025 protests in Indonesia, uh, it wasn't just the youth and the students and the young radicals who were out in the streets protesting, but long before that wave of protest, there was an
mm,
incident in this small town called Pati in mid-Java. And this is where the local residents started a sort of spontaneous uprising,
mm,
really a popular insurgency against the local ruler who had just imposed a 250% property tax increase
mm,
on the district. And they weren't taking it. They refused, and the whole town exploded in a sense, and it was revoked. So that was success.
mm,
But the interesting thing, what I found, is that this was magnified. This whole story about this popular insurgency happening in this very small town, which you
mm,
really don't associate with Gen Z or anything, that was picked up and magnified online, but also in offline discussions by these Gen Z. So all of a sudden, Instagram was exploding with, not and other social media with memes that said the revolution starts from Patti. And
ah,
so in terms of change, as an anthropologist, I then look at, oh, what does it say about class sensibilities? Because Gen Z protesters, middle class, the lower class, popular uprising in a small town, how these cross solidarities then kind of, uh, change certain class sensibilities, especially among middle class youth. Like, hey, we are not necessarily the heroes of this story, right? We can also reach out and learn from and forge coalitions with the people
mm,
in
mm.
that way.
Interesting. Speaking of Indonesia, we know that there was this big explosion of protest
Mhm.
and mass mobilization last year. Can you give us some updates in terms of like post-protest? So what is going on now in terms of repression? Are there
Mhm.
still, small scale mobilizations in the local levels or not? Yeah, so give us some updates.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the big riots, they didn't happen since September, but
Mhm.
protest has continued ever since because there was again and again there were new reasons to protest.
Mhm.
Then it was former President Suharto being, elevated into hero status, national hero. And then it was the criminal code revision that greatly expanded the powers of the police, for instance, and
Mhm.
expanded the instruments of repression in a legal way. So that really the lawfare kind of aspect. So then there's another, and it kept going. And then there were the floods in the natural disaster in Sumatra, which was completely mishandled and was clearly also linked to the deforestation that is happening on a big scale in Indonesia now for all these, plantation concessions and mining concessions that are very much linked to the regime. And that kept going on. And what's interesting is the repression has also, continued and unabated. Since August 2025, more than 700 protesters had been detained until last February, so still awaiting their trial. And next to that, I mean, more and more people got arrested, not just for protesting on the streets, but also for their online expressions, which was very easily labeled inflammatory content,
Mhm.
spreading inflammatory content. So that's the digital repression again that goes hand in hand with the repression of the street protest. And so protest continues, repression continues. But what's very interesting, what happened in August 2025, and this might also have to do with, how it's not just the students, not just the middle class youth who went out on the streets. Um, the fear for repression has has been eroded, and this is something very significant
Mm.
because it's something we don't see everywhere. But I do see it in Indonesia that, the chilling effect of digital repression that we always talk about, it just disappeared.
Mm.
Somehow a sort of tipping point has been reached. People continue to be, you know, have really harsh expressions
Mm.
about the government online, even though they know I can be arrested, every minute.
Mm.
So the threat of arrest, the threat of legal repression, digital repression, being attacked by trolls, it doesn't scare a lot of people anymore. And the more they see that of each other, the less this fear also, of course, becomes effective, right? And the clearest indication was that very recently there was a human rights activist from the group Contras who was attacked, an acid attack by, it turned out, 4 soldiers who were linked to the army's intelligence unit, which is like,
Mm.
as repressive and intimidating as it can get in a sense.
Mm.
He's still hospitalized. It's really a horrible, horrible attack, and really another line has been crossed in terms of repression and intimidation.
Mm.
But even then, that didn't scare people. I mean, one of the hashtags, the many that were just, and the memes that were exploding right after the attack, like really within the hour, was things like, we are, because he was blinded on one eye because of this acid attack, we are Andre Yunus's eyes. That's his name, Andre Yunus. And the more they repress us, the more we become brave and being courageous because of Andre Yunus,
Mm.
because of what happened to him. So this is the opposite effect of
Yeah.
repression,
Mm.
which is supposed to scare people. No, we are courageous because this happened.
Mm.
So that's I found very interesting, and this is really circulating online, especially. So really becoming a sort of viral sentiment, like, no, we're not afraid, yeah.
No, no, this is fascinating. I actually I just published a piece last year on this kind of repression mobilization nexus, right? Because
Hmm.
repression, um, if you cross certain lines, then basically it doesn't have the intended effect
Yeah,
on demobilization, right? But
yeah.
it could have the reverse effect of basically pushing people to basically you corner them and they have nothing else to lose and
Hmm.
they just break that barriers of fear. Do you see that happening in Indonesia right now, or is more or less like under the surface?
Well, more or less online mostly.
Online.
Yeah, and this is where sentiments start to spread. I mean, what we don't see now is a new super mass mobilization happening, but this can happen anytime because we don't really expect them.
Mm.
So that will for sure happen somewhere this year. And then it's interesting to see, okay, we've had this really mass mobilization. What will the next look like?
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
yeah. And then what will repression look like? Will
Will
that become
evolve.
more violent?
Mm.
Or will that become more sophisticated to kind of, more and more on the legal side rather than the actual physical violence side?
Mm.
Although the acid attack doesn't bode really well, of course, in that sense, like
Mm.
not very sophisticated.
Fascinating. All right. Now we're down to last question. And I just want to bring us back to the digital
Yeah.
aspect of resistance a little bit. So we've remember when we met last year, we talked about hope a little bit, and the role of hope in resistance, digital or not, right? And youth activism. And I mean, you also published something along this line, in light of youth mobilization last year, right? Basically saying that radical hope could play a significant role in the rhizomatic youth struggles, right? So, can you walk us through a little bit, like the key takeaway of that paper, and how would you
Yeah.
situate the role of hope, specifically in the context of countering digital repression?
Hmm. Yeah, so that article was based on the previous wave of protests that we saw in Indonesia, Thailand, of course, and
Mm.
Myanmar in 20 and Hong Kong, 2019 to 2021. And all of which were really severely repressed, right? I mean, each in different ways. I mean, the most violent, obviously, Myanmar, that's ongoing, which has now evolved into armed resistance. And in Indonesia and Thailand, more from the legal side, that there was a lot of repression of what could be expressed in a sense. Cooptation was also an aspect of that. And of course, in Hong Kong, the complete destruction of the infrastructures for resistance. So in those conditions of complete repression in different ways that we see in different countries, what do activists do in order to also rationalize for themselves why they keep on struggling, right? If they know that no, they don't have the resources and the tools to defeat the regime. And so this is where you see that a lot of online groups and platforms, but also, something like the Milk Tea Alliance, for instance, started to play a bigger role. And that online discussions also started to play a bigger role in showing that, or in convincing people and themselves also, like, hey, the struggle is not dead yet, because we see pockets of resistance still happening everywhere. And I think with the recent wave of protests in the past year, you see this hope reawaken again. So as long as it's still smoldering in a sense through these different nodes of resistance that continue to mobilize, that continue to advocate, no matter how small they are, as long as they're connected and remain connected with each other, even if it's just virtual, it will keep the hope alive in the sense that it will keep the prospect for possible resistance. To keep that visible, so that people see it.
So that
Prospect of
outlook for the
resistance.
future, right? And this is what you mean by the notion of connective spaces.
Yeah. So connective spaces is really not just in the virtual realm. I call it at the interface of virtual and material spaces. So where virtual communities also, form linked communities and overlapping communities with offline communities. So I think the importance of connective spaces is to have them not only digitally, so between different groups and how they, are connected as friends, connections on different digital platforms, and have online contacts and discussions there, but also to have it extend into material spaces. One interesting example, for instance, is a bookstore called Nowhere, which exists in Taiwan, in different places in Europe, and so on. And this is really a space where a lot of the Chinese-speaking or the Sinophone diaspora, and from Hong Kong as well, can congregate to kind of come together under the radar of this omnipresent, or at least the feared to be omnipresent, digital surveillance, cyber surveillance of the Chinese state. So it's very important, especially in a time of increasing digital surveillance, that is really accelerating, to also have these connections extend beyond digital platforms and into material spaces, and to nurture those connections there.
Absolutely fascinating, and what an inspiring conclusion of this podcast. Thank you so much, Yatun, for taking the time with us today from your busy schedule.
This was wonderful. Thanks. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.